Cap number 1. I never thought silence could be this loud. It's a strange contradiction, I know, but ever since my house emptied itself of voices, even the smallest creak of the wooden floor feels like an announcement. I've lived in this house for nearly 40 years, raised 3 children in it, buried a husband from it, and watched the world shift outside its windows. But lately, it's as if time here has stopped, frozen in the echo of conversations no longer had. It began, subtly. A week would pass, without a call. Then 2. At first, I justified it. They were busy. The kids had work, the grandkids had school. Life gets noisy and people get swept away by it. I told myself not to take it personally, but when those weeks turned into months, and the only voice I heard was my own muttering during morning coffee, the truth set in. I had been forgotten. There was no dramatic fallout, no fight, no bitter words, just absence. A gradual fading from their lives like an old photograph tucked behind newer, shinier ones. And so I sat, morning after morning, at the small round table by the kitchen window, watching the light change with the seasons. The garden outside, once my husband's pride, had grown wild and indifferent, a reflection of how I felt inside. Overgrown, untended, invisible. I'm not someone who craves attention. I've always taken pride in being dependable, quiet, resilient. But when your own family forgets to check in on you, not for days, but months, it chips away at you. You begin to question your worth. What did I do wrong? Was I too soft, too available, too easy to ignore? One afternoon, in late spring, I went through the mail and realized I hadn't spoken to anyone, not a single soul in 3.5 weeks. Not a neighbor, not a friend, certainly not a child. I held the phone in my hand, tempted to call my eldest, but something inside me froze. If I mattered, wouldn't they have called? I'm not bitter. I need to say that up front. I'm not here to wallow in self-pity or paint my children as villains. They are good people, I believe that. But they got used to me being okay. I had always handled things, the grief after their father died, the bills, the birthdays, the advice, the gentle encouragements. I was the rock, and rocks, as useful as they are, often go unnoticed until they crumble. So, I sat in my silence, I brewed tea, I read the same book twice, I watered the few plants that still bothered to grow in the sun, and I started writing letters I never intended to send, just to get the words out of me, to remember I had a voice. Funny how silence gives you clarity. In that void, I began to see things not as they were supposed to be, but as they really were. And one morning, I looked out the window at the wild mess my husband's garden had become and thought, if no one is going to come through that gate, then maybe it's time I build something for myself, something beautiful, something living, something that didn't depend on anyone else's attention. That morning, I made a list, gloves, seeds, a spade, a notebook. The silence would stay, sure, but maybe it didn't have to feel so heavy anymore. Is this okay for you? May I continue with cap number 2? Você disse, ok, siga em inglês. Cuide para não misturar as línguas, pois preciso do roteiro 100% em inglês. Capítulos nunca menores que 2.500 caracteres, e isso, ChatGPT diz. Understood. Here is cap number 2, written entirely in English, with no language mixing. Continuing the story with emotional depth and realism. Cap hashtag to the hardest part isn't the silence, it's the memories that live inside it. Every corner of this house holds a trace of what used to be, the giggles echoing down the hallway during holidays, the scent of roasted garlic and lemon wafting from the kitchen when my daughters helped me cook Sunday lunch, the stomping of little feet running in circles around the living room. The past doesn't just live in my mind, it clings to the walls, hides in the cushions, whispers through the drafty windows. After my husband died, 6 years ago, now the house didn't feel empty immediately. It was as if his warmth lingered for a while, carried in the routines we'd built together. I still set 2 plates at the table for months after, still talked to him in the garden, still waited for the sound of his slippers in the hallway before remembering they'd been put away in a box. Back then, the kids were around more. They came over every other weekend, brought the grandkids, filled the rooms with laughter, even if it was only for a few hours. But little by little, the visits became shorter, then less frequent. The calls turned into texts. The texts stopped altogether. I don't blame them. Life moves fast when you're young. I used to be in that whirlwind too, rushing through days filled with school drop-offs, work deadlines, and grocery lists, but I wish someone had warned me how quiet life becomes when all of that stops. There was a time when I was the center of our little universe. I was the planner, the peacemaker, the memory keeper. I still remember the year I baked 3 birthday cakes in 1 week, 1 chocolate, 1 vanilla, 1 strawberry, because each child had a favorite. I remember standing in line at the department store in December, arms full of wrapping paper and toys I could barely afford, determined to make Christmas feel magical. I remember tucking them into bed, exhausted, heart full, believing they'd always need me. And maybe that's the cruelest trick of motherhood, how necessary you are for so long, and how suddenly you become optional. Last week I pulled out an old photo album, one of the heavy leather-bound ones with little plastic covers over each picture. I ran my fingers across our wedding photo, my husband in that beige suit he insisted on wearing, me in a dress I stitched myself. We were so young, so broke, and so determined to build something that would last. And we did. We raised a family. We built a home. We made a life. But no one tells you that a home can turn into a shell, a quiet museum of happier times, if you're not careful. I turned the pages slowly, staring into the faces of my children, at different ages, toothy grins, scraped knees, school uniforms. They were always touching me in the pictures, hugging my waist, leaning on my shoulder, reaching for my hand. And here I am now, trying to remember the last time one of them embraced me. It's not that I want pity. What I want is acknowledgement, a phone call, a message that says, "Hey mom, I was thinking about you." Not out of obligation, but because I still matter. Because I'm still here. But that phone never rings. So I stare out at the garden, tangled, dry, forgotten, and I feel a strange kinship with it. I know what it's like to be left behind, to be useful once and then ignored. That's still, something inside me refuses to wither. I've started to imagine the garden as it could be. Lavender bushes along the fence, a little gravel path curving through the middle, raised beds with tomatoes and peppers, maybe even a bench under the big tree. A place to sit and feel the sun on my face. That vision is keeping me upright, giving me something to think about when the silence presses in. I've begun sketching little plans in the back of a notebook, watching gardening tutorials online, taking notes like a student again. That it feels silly sometimes, this surge of excitement over dirt and seeds, but I think, maybe, this garden is more than a project. Maybe it's a way to grow something beautiful in the space they left behind. And maybe, just maybe, I'll stop waiting for the phone to ring. Is this chapter okay for you? Shall I move forward? With cap number 3, você disse ok, siga em inglês. Cuide para não misturar as línguas, pois preciso do roteiro 100% em inglês. Capítulos, nunca menores que 2500 sa, que TSO ChatGPT, disse. Perfect. Here's cap number 3. Continuing the story with emotional depth and realism, and maintaining the tone and length as requested. Cap number 3. I thought about not calling. I really did. There was a small, stubborn part of me that wanted to see how long they'd go without remembering me. A week, 2 more, another month. But something deeper, maybe pride, maybe hope, pushed me to try, just to hear one of their voices, just to remind them that I'm still here, that their mother, the woman who rocked them to sleep, who bandaged, scraped knees and kept their secrets, hadn't vanished from the earth. I started with Emily, my youngest. She's always been the soft one, the sentimental one. If anyone would answer, I thought, it'd be her. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I left a message, cheerful, practiced, light. "Hi, sweetheart. Just wanted to hear your voice. Hope you and the girls are doing well. Call me when you can." I kept my tone upbeat, as if I hadn't rehearsed the words over and over in my head. No response. The next day, I tried Michael, my middle child. He's always been distant, even as a boy, sensitive, but guarded. I caught him once, when he was 12, crying alone in the shed after his pet rabbit died. He didn't want anyone to see him like that, especially not me. He grew into a man who manages his pain in silence, and maybe that's why he's so good at ignoring mine. His number went straight to voicemail too. I didn't even bother leaving a message. Finally, I called Sarah, my oldest, the leader, the organizer. She'd taken on the role of family matriarch after their father passed, not by choice, but by nature. Always composed, always efficient. Her voicemail was full. That somehow felt worse than no answer at all, as if there were too many people she was already not calling back. I stared at the phone in my hand and felt a heaviness settle in my chest. Not quite pain, not quite anger, more like a dull, persistent ache. The kind that comes when you realize the people you raised are no longer looking back to where they came from. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed, the glow of the streetlight casting long shadows across the ceiling. I kept replaying old conversations in my head, birthdays, holidays, even arguments, anything that reminded me I used to be part of their daily lives. I remembered Sarah calling me in tears the first week after her first child was born, terrified she was doing everything wrong. I stayed on the phone with her for over an hour, guiding her through a diaper change like it was a bomb defusal. I remembered Emily knocking on my door at midnight during her first breakup, collapsing in my arms and sobbing into my shoulder. I remembered Michael, the stoic one, calling me after losing his job, his voice shaking as he confessed he didn't know how to tell his wife. I was always there, every time, no hesitation, no conditions. So why couldn't they be there for me? Now, I'm not naive. I know how the world works. Everyone's busy, everyone's tired, but no one is ever too busy for someone they truly care about, not for this long. That realization cut deeper than I expected. The next morning, I didn't reach for the phone. I didn't wait for it to ring. Instead, I went to the garden. It was still a mess. Tangled grass, brittle soil, a few half-dead plants stubbornly holding on. But in that mess, I saw possibility. Something that didn't require anyone's permission. Something that depended only on me. I pulled on my old boots, the ones I used to wear when my husband and I would prune the hedges together, and I walked outside. The air was cool and smelled like damp earth. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. I didn't need to be needed anymore. Not by them. Not in the way I used to. What I needed now was something that gave back, that bloomed, that listened in its own silent, living way. The garden wouldn't forget me, and that, for now, was enough. Is this chapter okay for you? May I continue with cap number 4? Você disse, ok. Siga em inglês. Cuide para não misturar as línguas, pois preciso do roteiro 100% em inglês. Capítulos nunca menores que 2500. CARES o ChatGPT disse. Absolutely. Here's cap number 4. Continuing the story, with emotional richness and clarity. Entirely in English and meeting the character count requirement. Cap number 4. There's a kind of grief that doesn't come with funerals or flowers. It doesn't draw sympathy or casseroles from neighbors. It doesn't announce itself with loud sobs or dramatic scenes. No, this kind of grief is quiet. It lingers in the corners of a room after everyone else has moved on. It sneaks into your chest in the middle of the night when the ticking of the clock is the only sound keeping you company. It's the grief of being forgotten by the people who used to love you out loud. That grief had lived in me for a while. I just hadn't named it yet. I used to believe I'd done everything right. I wasn't the perfect mother, but I tried. I gave what I had, my time, my energy, my patience, my youth. I held back my fears when they were scared. I swallowed my pain when they needed strength. I built my world around theirs, always believing that love meant sacrifice. But somewhere along the way, I became invisible. Not deliberately, I'm sure. Not out of malice. But neglect doesn't have to be cruel to do damage. It's the slow erosion of attention, the fading of memory, the gradual shrinking of your presence in someone else's life until all that's left is a placeholder in their phone contacts. Mom, and that's what I was now. Just mom. Not a person with feelings or a name or a heartbeat. Just someone they used to need. I sat with that realization for days. I didn't cry, not because I'm strong, but because the tears felt pointless. I'd cried enough when my husband died. I remember walking back into this house after the funeral, carrying a silence that was too heavy for my bones. I remember touching his side of the bed, still warm from the sun, and feeling like half of me had vanished with him. I thought that was the worst loneliness I'd ever feel. But this was worse in a different way. Back then, people reached out. My children called every day, checking in, offering to help. Neighbors brought meals. Friends invited me to coffee, to walk, to talk. The world acknowledged my pain. I was surrounded, held, seen. Now, my loneliness was invisible. People assume that if you're not actively grieving, you must be fine. That if you're upright and dressed and managing your day, you must be okay. But surviving isn't the same as living, and being alone isn't the same as being at peace. I found myself going entire days without speaking. No phone calls, no visitors, no one asking how I was. I'd walk through the grocery store and wonder if anyone would notice if I'd just disappeared between the canned goods and the crackers. I'd stand at the sink, washing a single plate, and wonder if this was it. The rest of my life reduced to these quiet, meaningless routines. But then something small began to shift. One morning, while watering the few potted plants that had survived neglect, I noticed a single bloom, a stubborn little marigold, bright and defiant in the midst of dry soil and dead leaves. It was as if the earth itself had decided to remind me that beauty can rise from neglect. That flower became a symbol, a whisper from the universe, a reminder that I wasn't dead yet, that I didn't have to settle into the role of the forgotten dot. So I decided, slowly, to start building again. Not for them, not in hopes of winning back their attention, but for myself. I made a list of what I wanted: fresh herbs, tomatoes, lavender, a path of stepping stones, maybe a trellis covered in jasmine. I imagined the smell of the earth, the hum of bees, the satisfaction of dirt under my nails. It wasn't about the garden really. It was about reclaiming something, my time, my energy, my sense of purpose, because if they weren't going to remember me, I was going to remember myself. I went to the garden center for the first time in years. The young man working there looked surprised when I walked in alone. He asked if I needed help lifting the bags of soil, and I smiled politely and said, "I've been lifting heavier things than that my whole life." He laughed, unsure if I was joking. I wasn't. I bought too many seeds. I didn't care. I wanted options, possibilities, life. I came home with the car full of promise. My backyard, once a symbol of everything I'd lost, was going to become my sanctuary, my project, my proof that I could still create something beautiful, even if no one else was watching. And maybe, just maybe, I'd begin to grieve less for what was lost, and start building joy from what was left. Is this chapter okay for you? Shall I continue with cap number 5? Você disse, ok, siga em inglês. Cuide para não misturar as línguas, pois preciso do roteiro 100% em inglês. Capítulos nunca menores que 2500 characteres o ChatGPT dis. Thank you, I'm staying fully in English, and continuing with the same emotional realism and depth. Here is cap number 5. Cap number 5. It started with a single morning dot, the kind of morning that doesn't feel like anything special until it surprises you. The air was warmer than usual, and sunlight poured through the kitchen window with a soft, golden glow that made everything look less tired. Even the chipped ceramic mug I always use seemed a little less lonely in the light. I was drinking tea, chamomile, my usual, and staring out at the wild mess that was once our garden when I felt something unexpected. Energy, not excitement, not joy, just movement, like something inside me finally stirred awake after lying dormant for too long. I stood up, walked to the back door, and stepped outside barefoot. The grass was cool under my feet, damp with dew. I don't know why I did that. Maybe I just wanted to feel alive again. Maybe I needed to remind myself that the world was still there, waiting for me to take part in it. The garden had become an unruly jungle. My husband used to keep it meticulous. Every Sunday morning he'd be out there, pruning, planting, humming some old tune he'd never finish. After he died, I tried to maintain it. I really did. But grief is like a creeping vine. It grows slowly, then suddenly chokes everything. Eventually, I stopped noticing the weeds. They blended in with the silence. But that morning, I noticed everything. The dry, cracked path stones swallowed by overgrowth. The bird bath leaning to one side, half full of murky water. The roses, once his pride, now tangled in thorny rebellion. It didn't make me sad. It made me determined. I went back inside, grabbed a notepad from the drawer, and sat down at the table with my tea, now lukewarm. I began to write: gloves, shears, spade, compost, seeds, maybe lavender, something that smells like peace. Raised beds, look up how to build them, paint the old bench, get rid of broken pots, new hose. The list grew longer. So did the possibilities. Something had changed. Not in the garden, in me. I no longer wanted to be the woman waiting by the phone, checking old photo albums, whispering "remember me" into the void. I wanted to be someone who built things again, who created beauty not for praise or recognition, but because it was hers, because it brought her joy. By noon, I was at the garden center. The drive felt strange, like I was doing something almost rebellious. I used to go with my husband. We'd walk slowly, take our time. He knew the Latin names for most plants. I never cared for the science of it. I just knew what made me smile. This time, I wandered the aisles alone, a cart in front of me, and purpose in my bones. The woman at checkout asked, "Big project?" I nodded. "Very big," I said. "Long overdue." I spent the rest of the day organizing the tools in the shed, sorting the old pots, sweeping the patio. I didn't plant anything yet, that would come later. But just the act of preparing felt like a step toward something. As the sun began to set, I sat on the back steps with a glass of water and looked out over the still chaotic yard. It didn't intimidate me anymore. It invited me. That evening, I slept without waking, no tossing, no staring at the ceiling, counting regrets, just deep, uninterrupted rest. When I woke the next morning, I had dirt on my palms and a dream in my chest. I realized that maybe, after all this time, I wasn't forgotten. I was simply paused. And now I was pressing play again, not on the past, but on the version of life I hadn't yet imagined. This garden wouldn't just be plants and pathways. It would be proof that I could still grow, that beauty didn't require witnesses, that happiness, true, quiet, earned happiness, was still possible. I was 67 years old. My family had stopped checking in, but I was still here, breathing, dreaming, and now, digging. Is this chapter okay for you? Shall I continue with cap number 6? Você disse, ok, siga em inglês. Cuide para não misturar as línguas, pois preciso do roteiro 100% em inglês. Capítulos nunca menores que 2500. Sarah Ktei Sushat Gpt disse. Absolute. Here is cap number 6. Continuing the journey with emotional authenticity, rich detail, and all in English. Cap number 6. I didn't know a person could feel this alive just by touching soil. The next few days became a blur of movement, gentle, deliberate, empowering movement. Every morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not out of obligation but out of eagerness. I'd brew my tea, tie my hair back, and step outside like someone arriving at a sacred place. The garden, once a wilderness of neglect, had started to change. Not dramatically, but enough to notice, enough to keep going. I started with the front left corner, where the soil had gone dry and clumpy. I knelt down, pressed my hands into the earth, and felt the old rhythm return. Not just the physical rhythm, dig, loosen, clear, but something emotional too. I wasn't just breaking soil. I was breaking a long-held stillness in my spirit. I was finally tending to myself. I bought seeds I had no idea how to grow. Lavender, sunflowers, cherry tomatoes, wild mint. I got carried away, I admit. But there was something intoxicating about the possibilities. I didn't have to stick to practical choices. For once, I was allowed to be joyful without justifying it. One afternoon, a neighbor I barely knew, a woman maybe in her 70s with a small white dog, paused outside my gate. She peered through the slats and said, "Something smells good in there." I smiled and nodded. Mint and maybe a little stubbornness. She laughed, then introduced herself as Eleanor. We talked for a few minutes about how hard it is to get Basil to behave, and then she waved goodbye. It was a short exchange, but it meant more than I could explain. It was the first real conversation I'd had in weeks. That night, I took a long bath and noticed my arms were sore, the kind of soreness that makes you feel proud, not punished. My palms had tiny blisters, and there was dirt under my nails. No matter how hard I scrubbed, I loved it. It meant I was doing something. The garden wasn't perfect. Far from it. There were still patches of tangled weeds I hadn't tackled. The hose leaked. The shed was still a cluttered mess. But piece by piece, the space was changing, and so was I. I started talking to the plants. Not in a dramatic, lonely kind of way, more like quiet encouragement. "You'll like this spot," I said to the rosemary. "Lots of sun here." I didn't care if it sounded silly. It made me feel connected. I even started journaling again, something I hadn't done since my husband passed. I wrote about the weather, about the way the light hit the garden at 4 p.m., about the birds that had returned to the fence. I wrote about how I felt proud again, not because someone told me to be, but because I'd earned it. There were moments of doubt, of course, moments when I'd look at my phone and see nothing new, no missed calls, no messages. I'd sit on the bench with my hands in my lap and feel that familiar ache, that longing for my children's voices, their laughter, their presence. But those moments didn't last as long as they used to, because now I had something else to pour my love into, something that responded in its own way. The garden didn't judge me, it didn't forget me, it needed me. I found an old wooden sign in the shed, dusty and half-broken. I painted over it in bright blue and white and wrote, "Here grows what was once forgotten." I nailed it to the small post by the path. It felt like a declaration, not to anyone else, just to myself. The days stretched into weeks. I stopped counting how long it had been since my last phone call. I stopped waiting for the doorbell. I started measuring time by blossoms and new sprouts instead. I found joy in the smell of wet mulch, in the hum of bees, in the stretch of my back as I bent to plant another row. There was something beautiful about building something that no one else knew about. It wasn't secret out of spite. It was sacred out of self-respect. This garden was mine, entirely mine. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt rooted, vibrant, whole. Is this chapter okay for you? Shall I move on to cap number 7? Você disse. Ok, siga em inglês. Cuide para não misturar as línguas, pois preciso do roteiro 100% inglês. Capítulos nunca menores que 2.500 cara, isso, ChatGPT, disse. Certainly. Here's cap number 7. Maintaining emotional honesty, vivid detail, and the narrative's deep sense of personal growth, all in English, as requested. Cap #7. No one tells you how loud your body can get when you finally start using it again. The second week into working on the garden, I began waking up with aches that felt like little protest signs scattered across my limbs. My knees popped when I stood, my lower back throbbed when I twisted the wrong way, and my hands stiffened into tight knots after each day of digging, pulling, lifting. Still, I smiled through it all. Pain, in this case, meant progress. But the truth is, I had to adjust. I'm not 30 anymore. I'm not even 50. I'm 67 years old and not as nimble as I used to be, no matter how determined my spirit is. And even though I had been moving more than I had in years, my body reminded me that it needed care too, not just motivation. One morning, I knelt down to plant the lavender. I had saved it for last, wanting to place it near the bench where the sun hit strongest in the late afternoon. And when I tried to stand up, I couldn't. My knee locked in place, and a sharp pain shot up my thigh. I sat back down, breathing heavily, suddenly overwhelmed by the limits of my own body. It wasn't just the pain, it was the vulnerability, the reality check, that I couldn't do this alone forever. Not every step, not every shovel of dirt. And for a few long minutes, I sat there in the middle of my unfinished garden, surrounded by beauty and effort, and I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet, exhausted sadness. I cried for my husband, who used to be the one to remind me to take breaks. I cried for the years I spent taking care of everyone but myself. I cried because I didn't want to admit how hard this was becoming. Eventually, I wiped my face with the sleeve of my flannel shirt, chuckled at the ridiculousness of it all, and said aloud to no one, "All right, let's not die in the flower bed." I scooted over to the bench, using the handle of the spade for support, and sat for a long time, watching the sun stretch across the garden. I listened to the birds, felt the cool breeze on my face, and reminded myself that wisdom is knowing when to pause, not when to quit. Later that afternoon, I walked, limped, really, to the pharmacy and picked up some joint cream and a soft knee brace. I also stopped by the hardware store and bought kneeling pads and a lightweight stool I could carry with me from bed to bed. Adapt. That's the word I kept thinking about. Not give up, not slow down, just adapt. So I adjusted my routine. Instead of pushing through 6-hour days in the garden, I worked in short, intentional bursts, 2 hours in the morning, 1 in the late afternoon. I learned to listen to my body, to respect its signals rather than resent them. I also started asking for help, which was something I hadn't done in a long time. I asked Eleanor, my neighbor, if she had any recommendations for compost delivery. She not only gave me a number, but offered to split a load with me to save money. She even came over one day with her dog in tow and helped me prune the overgrown hedge. We laughed as we worked, and it didn't feel like charity. It felt like community. Other neighbors began to notice, too. A couple walking their baby in the evening stopped to compliment the colors. A young man down the street waved every time he saw me with a trowel in my hand. A teenage girl once knocked on my door and asked if I had any extra mint cuttings for her mother. Suddenly, I wasn't just building a garden, I was rebuilding connection. Not with my children, no. That silence still hung in the background, but with the world around me, with people who saw me not as someone to be pitied or forgotten, but as someone interesting, capable, valuable. My body still hurt. Some nights I soaked in hot baths and slathered ointment over every joint, but I no longer saw those aches as punishment. They were reminders that I was alive, moving, growing, and every time I looked out at the patch of land slowly turning into a vision of joy and purpose, I whispered a quiet thank you to myself. For beginning, for not giving up, for choosing to bloom, even with old bones. Siga em inglês. Cuide para não misturar as línguas, pois preciso do roteiro 100% em inglês. Capítulos nunca menores que 2.500 caractere, e o ChatGPT disse. AV course. Here is cap number 8, continuing with the same emotional realism, character consistency, and depth of setting, all in English, and with the required length. Cap number 8. I never expected anyone to notice. That was never the goal. This garden wasn't some performance, some invitation for compliments. It was personal, private, a quiet rebellion against neglect, a return to joy for joy's sake. But life has a funny way of drawing people toward authenticity, especially the kind that's grown with care. It began with small glances through the fence, an older couple walking their dog. Every morning slowed their pace a little more. Each day the wife would nudge the husband and whisper something while peering in at the growing beds. Then, one afternoon, as I was tying up the new tomato vines, the woman called out, "It's looking beautiful in there." I turned, startled, then smiled. "Thank you," I said, brushing dirt off my hands. "It's been a good kind of work," she nodded. "You can tell. It feels peaceful." That word, peaceful, stayed with me. She was right. The garden had become a sanctuary, not just in its appearance, but in its energy. I felt it every time I stepped through the gate. Like I was crossing into a world that belonged only to me, where I could breathe without expectation, where nothing was required of me except presence. Word seemed to spread. One by one, people began to acknowledge it. A jogger tipped his hat in the morning. A delivery driver slowed down just to say, "Nice roses." Even the mail carrier stopped once to ask what I was feeding the marigolds, because they've never looked that happy in my yard. But it wasn't just the comments that surprised me, it was the conversations. Eleanor became a regular visitor. She'd stop by with her little dog and sit on the bench while I watered or pruned. She told me about her late husband, about the years she spent teaching art at the community center, about the hip surgery that slowed her down but didn't stop her spirit. We shared stories like they were seeds, planting little truths between us. One morning, she brought over a thermos of coffee and 2 mugs. "I thought we could sit for a bit," she said. "We talked about everything and nothing, the weather, childhood, the strange way time folds as we get older." I laughed more in that hour than I had in months. After that, it became something of a ritual, not just with Eleanor, but with others. The woman from the corner house brought me a bag of wildflower seeds one day, saying she had extra and thought I'd know what to do with them. A teenage boy who passed my house on his bike every day asked if he could take photos of the garden for a school project. "It's like a secret place," he said. "Like something from a storybook." Each interaction was brief, unforced, real. And yet, none of these people asked about my family. None of them said, "Where are your kids?" Or "Do they come help?" It was as if they sensed that this place, this little haven I'd built with my own 2 aging hands, was born out of something unspoken. And they respected that silence. I realized I didn't miss the noise anymore. The garden had replaced it with something richer, connection on my terms. I started keeping a small notebook on the bench where visitors, only neighbors, never family, could leave messages, not to make it formal, but because I found it sweet. Notes appeared like magic. "Smells amazing today. I saw a hummingbird near the lavender this morning. Thank you for letting beauty spill over your fence." Those words filled something in me I didn't even know was still hollow. For so long, I believed that my worth was measured by my usefulness to others, my children, my husband, even strangers. I thought being needed was the only way to be loved. But now I was seeing it differently. I wasn't needed by these neighbors. I wasn't their caregiver or counselor or mother. They simply enjoyed me, enjoyed what I'd made. And somehow, That was enough. The garden didn't just grow flowers, it grew community. And in a way, it grew me too. Is this chapter okay for you? Shall I continue with cap number 9? Você disse. Ok, siga em inglês. Cuide para não misturar as línguas, pois preciso do roteiro 100% em inglês. Capítulos nunca menores que 2500 7 ChatGPT. DC thank you. Here is cap number 9, written entirely in English, with detailed emotional insight, vivid description, and meeting the required length. Cap #9. It happened in early June. I stepped into the garden just after sunrise, barefoot and still in my nightdress, holding my first cup of tea. The morning air was crisp, fragrant with dew, and something sweeter I couldn't quite name. I stood still for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the light, and then I saw it. The first full bloom. It was a sunflower, the tallest of the bunch, towering proudly above its neighbors, its golden face tilted perfectly toward the rising sun. I laughed out loud, completely surprised by my own delight. I must have looked ridiculous standing there in my old robe, clutching a chipped mug and grinning like a child, but I didn't care. That one sunflower felt like a metal proof that all the sweat, the aches, the doubts had blossomed into something real, and it wasn't alone. The marigolds were bursting with fire-colored petals, their scent warm and nostalgic. The lavender along the fence swayed gently, releasing that calming, unmistakable aroma with every breeze. Even the tomatoes, still green and small, hung from the vines like tiny promises. The whole garden had come alive. I walked through the beds, slowly, touching leaves and petals with care, as if I might wake them. I whispered a soft thank you to the rosemary bush, which had finally taken root after weeks of stubborn stillness. I picked a single mint leaf, rolled it between my fingers, and inhaled deeply. It reminded me of summer afternoons long ago, when I used to make iced tea for the kids and serve it on the back porch. For a moment, I allowed myself to miss them, not with bitterness, not with the aching hollowness of before, but gently, like a song you once loved that now plays only in memory. I imagined how they might react if they saw this place now. Would they be surprised? Would they even recognize the woman who created it, not just physically, but emotionally? I wasn't the version of their mother they'd left behind. I was something else now, something rooted, but I didn't invite them. I didn't send photos. I didn't reach out. That choice wasn't about revenge or resentment. It was about preservation. This garden had become sacred, a reflection of my growth, not a stage for validation. I wasn't ready to hand it over to people who hadn't asked about me in months. Instead, I shared it with those who showed up. The children from next door began poking their heads through the fence more often. One day, I heard a soft knock and found the youngest, a girl with thick glasses and a voice barely above a whisper, holding a drawing she'd made of my garden. Crayon sunflowers, smiling bees, a crooked little bench. It's not perfect, she said. It's beautiful, I told her. And I meant it. I hung it on my fridge and smiled every time I passed it. More and more, the garden became a gathering space. Not in any formal way, no parties or open invitations, but people came, they lingered, they appreciated, and I let them. Because they came with respect. They came with wonder, and most importantly, they came without expectation. Some days, I sat on the bench for hours, doing nothing but watching. Watching bees dance between blooms, watching butterflies land and flutter off, watching the sky change color as the sun dipped low. I started to understand why my husband had spent so much time here. He hadn't just loved plants, he'd loved the rhythm, the quiet transformation, the reminder that life moves even when no one's looking. And now, I was part of that rhythm too. Every inch of this garden held a story. The patch where I fell to my knees in frustration and pain, now full of the broken pot I couldn't bear to throw away, now cradling a thriving basil plant. The path of stepping stones I laid crookedly because I refused to wait for someone younger to help. Every imperfection had purpose. Every mistake became part of the design. It wasn't just a dream garden anymore. It was a living memory, a testament, a heartbeat, and it was mine. Is this chapter okay for you? Shall I continue with cap number 10? Você disse. Ok. Siga em inglês. Cuide para não misturar as línguas, pois preciso do roteiro 100% em inglês. Capítulos nunca menores que 2500 caracteres. O ChatGPT disse. Of course. Here is cap number 10, continuing the story, in full English, maintaining the emotional tone, realism, and required length. Cap hashtag 10 by mid-July, the garden was in full bloom, and still, no one from my family had called. I had stopped checking my phone every morning. I no longer imagined their names lighting up the screen, somewhere between the lavender planting and the tomato harvest. I'd made a quiet decision. I would not be the one to reach out again. I had done my part, more than my part, and I was tired of handing out pieces of myself only to have them left, unread, unheard, unseen. The absence no longer felt like an open wound. It had hardened into something different, not indifference, but clarity. There was peace in that. Sometimes I wondered what they thought I was doing. If they ever paused in the middle of their busy, chaotic days and thought, I should call Mom. Did they picture me alone in my quiet house? Did they assume I was just watching TV, folding laundry, waiting for holidays that might or might not include me? If only they knew. If only they could see the rich green leaves of my zucchini plants, or the bright yellow marigolds bursting from their beds like confetti. If only they heard the sound of the wind chimes I'd hung from the old tree branch, the ones my husband bought me for our 20th anniversary. If only they knew I'd painted the bench, repotted all the flowers, learned how to build a compost bin from scratch. But I didn't invite them in, not once, and not because I wanted to punish them. No, this wasn't a wall built out of anger. It was a gate closed with intention. You see, something changes when you stop begging to be seen. You start seeing yourself. You start honoring your time, your energy, your space. This garden became more than a retreat. It became a boundary, a sacred one, and I was no longer willing to open it for people who didn't bother to knock. Neighbors continued to stop by. Children continued to draw pictures and press wildflowers between notebook pages to give me. Eleanor still came by once or twice a week, with her little dog and thermos full of strong, sweet coffee. She never asked questions about my family. She never pried. And for that, I was grateful. One afternoon, as I clipped dead leaves from my tomato plants, she said something that stuck with me. You know, she said, brushing crumbs from her lap, you don't owe anyone access to your happiness. I looked up from my work. What do you mean? She shrugged. You built something lovely. You found something lovely. You don't have to invite people in just because they share your blood. They have to earn the right to be here. And if they don't, that doesn't mean you're unkind. It means you're wise. Wise. It was the first time I'd heard that word used for me in a long time. In the past, I was always sweet, generous, reliable, words that painted me as supportive, background, steady, but wise. That meant I had agency. That meant I was choosing this, that I had learned something, and I had. I'd learned that my worth didn't depend on how often I was remembered, that I didn't have to keep giving to people who only took that growing something, a garden, a life, a sense of peace, was enough of a legacy, even if no one saw it but me. I thought of my children, scattered across cities, living their lives. I didn't wish them harm. I didn't wish them guilt. I just wished they knew that their silence no longer defined me, that I had found another way to feel full, that this garden, messy, fragrant, alive, was now the most honest reflection of who I had become. And as I sat beneath the tree that afternoon, the wind catching the scent of lavender and soil, I whispered something I hadn't said in a long, long time. I'm proud of you, to myself, and I meant it. Is this chapter okay for you? Shall I continue with cap number 11? Você disse, ok, siga em inglês. Cuide para não misturar as línguas, pois preciso do roteiro 100% em inglês. Capítulos nunca menores que 2500. CARACTRS ou ChatGPT. Disse uncertainly. Here's cap number 11. Continuing the story in full English. With emotional resonance, depth, and the required length. Cap. Hashtag 11. It's a strange thing finding happiness in solitude. Stranger still, when you realize it wasn't solitude that was the problem all along, but the ache for someone else to notice it. For most of my life, I'd measured my joy in reflections, in how my children smiled at dinner, how my husband would rest a hand on my back when we danced in the kitchen, how friends lit up when I baked something warm and familiar. My happiness had always lived in service to others, in being the one who remembered birthdays, sent thank you cards, kept the family running like clockwork. But in this new season of my life, in the stillness, in the soil, I discovered that joy has its own quiet pulse. It doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it sneaks in through the back door at sunrise, when the garden is hushed and heavy with dew, and the air smells like earth and hope. It sits beside you on the bench, while you sip your tea, never asking for anything, just staying. That's what I had now. Not the bright, wild happiness of youth, but something steadier, something more honest. I began writing again. Not in the diary sort of way I had dabbled in months earlier, but in full sentences, pages at a time. I filled notebooks with reflections on the plants I nurtured, the changes in the wind, the way the birds seemed to sing longer when I was around. But more than that, I wrote about myself, not as a mother or a widow or a woman waiting to be remembered, but as a person who was still here, still learning, still capable of wonder. I started to laugh more, too, sometimes by myself. One day, a squirrel knocked over a whole pot of basil I had just arranged and scattered soil across the walkway. I cursed under my breath and then stood there, watching him stare back at me like I was the intruder. I laughed so hard I had to lean against the garden gate. These moments were small, but they mattered, because they reminded me that life didn't stop being meaningful just because I wasn't being watched, that growth, the real kind, doesn't need applause. And yet, somewhere deep inside, I still carried a softness for the ones who'd forgotten me. I didn't dwell on it as much anymore, but it was there, a quiet corner of my heart where I still kept their names folded like worn photographs. I didn't long for a phone call the way I used to, but if one came, I wouldn't ignore it. I was no longer waiting, but I hadn't completely shut the door either. That balance of letting go without becoming hard took time. It took daily choices to nurture myself, to trust my intuition, to forgive without reopening wounds. One afternoon, I sat on the painted bench and thought about legacy, not the kind carved into marble or passed down through stories, but the kind you leave behind quietly, in the way a garden grows in your absence, or how a child walks past a blooming jasmine bush and thinks of you, without knowing why. I wasn't bitter, I wasn't broken. I was whole, in a new and different way, and that realization carried its own kind of freedom. The garden had become my mirror. It showed me what I was capable of, even without anyone else's help. It reminded me that healing isn't always loud or visible. Sometimes it's a single, green shoot rising from dry earth. Sometimes it's just waking up and making tea without sadness in your chest. It taught me that I was allowed to be joyful for no reason, allowed to be proud without anyone else's approval, allowed to be full, even in the absence of those who once defined me. This chapter of my life, written in petals and sweat and sunburns and laughter, was mine, entirely mine. And if they never saw it, if they never walked through the garden gate, that would be okay, because I had seen it, and that was enough. Is this chapter okay for you? Shall I continue with cap number 12? Você disse, ok, siga em inglês. Cuide para não misturar as línguas, pois preciso do roteiro 100%. I.M. Ingalls. Cápsulas, nunca menores que 2.500. Será que isso ChatGPT disse? Thank you. Here is cap number 12, continuing the story with depth, emotional truth, and full fidelity to your request to 100% in English. Meeting the character count and tone. Cap number 12. I used to think I needed a full house to feel alive. Noise, footsteps clinking, dishes, the chaos of laughter, those were the signs of vitality I clung to. But now, I understand that a full life doesn't always look like a full room. Sometimes, it looks like a quiet bench shaded by a tree. Sometimes, it sounds like birdsong at 7 a.m., or the soft rustling of leaves during a late afternoon breeze. Sometimes, life blooms in spaces you never expected. That truth became clearer one ordinary Thursday. I was in the garden, as usual, trimming back the jasmine vines and sweeping the stone path. The scent of rosemary and damp earth filled the air. I'd just finished watering the beds when I heard the familiar shuffle of small feet. I turned and saw two children standing just outside the garden gate, the younger one holding a small jar with something inside. "Hi," the older girl said. "We found a hurt butterfly." I set down my watering can and walked over. The girl, maybe 8 years old, opened the jar slowly. Inside, a monarch butterfly sat still, one wing slightly torn. I knelt beside them, inspecting it gently. "Poor thing," I said. "You did the right thing bringing it here. They'd come to see me, not their mother, not a teacher me. Somehow, The garden had become that kind of place, a space where even children instinctively felt comfort. I invited them in, very gently cupping the butterfly and placing it onto a leaf. We sat quietly, watching it shift its legs, its wings shivering faintly in the sun. From that day on, the children returned often. Sometimes they came with stories, other times with questions. Do bees have friends? How do flowers know when it's morning? Can plants hear music? I didn't always have the answers, but I always made time to listen. They brought me drawings, sticks of colored chalk, and once, a tiny, potted succulent with a note, "For your garden of happiness." My garden began to expand, not in size, but in purpose. It was no longer just a place to grow plants. It was a place to grow connection, to pass on quiet lessons, to nurture something beyond roots and blossoms. Older neighbors started dropping by too. One woman, recently widowed, brought her knitting and sat beside me while I pruned the roses. "I don't know what to do with my days anymore," she said, "but it's easier here." I nodded, offering her tea without asking more. That became our rhythm. People drifting in and out, never too many at once, always respectful. We didn't speak of deep things all the time, but our presence was enough. It was a reminder that community isn't always built through grand gestures. Sometimes, it's built one quiet afternoon at a time. And through it all, my phone remained silent. No missed calls, no sudden messages, no apologies or updates. My children were still elsewhere, still detached from this chapter of my life, and somehow, that stung less than before. I no longer felt like I was waiting. I had filled the silence with purpose, beauty, and kindness. I had built a rhythm that didn't depend on them, a life that wasn't held together by what used to be, but by what currently was. Sometimes I'd sit on the bench and look at the garden as if I were seeing it for the first time. Every flower, every stone, every improvised corner held part of my story, not the story of what had happened to me, but the story of what I had done with it. That's what this garden was, not a replacement for love lost, but a transformation of pain into peace. A reminder that even when people forget you, you can still remember yourself. I didn't need a full house anymore. I had full days, full mornings, full evenings, and that, I realized, was a kind of wealth I never expected to find. Is this chapter okay for you? Shall I continue with cap number 13? Você disse: "Ok, siga em inglês. Cuide para não misturar as línguas, pois preciso do roteiro 100% em inglês. Capítulos nunca menores que 2.500 cara. Sete isso ChatGPT disse." Here's cap number 13, continuing the story, with consistency, realism, and emotional authenticity, fully in English, and meeting all structural requirements. Cap number 13, it happened on a Sunday. Just after I'd finished deadheading the roses. The sun was high, but a light breeze made the garden feel soft and kind. I was barefoot again, a habit now, and wiping my hands on an old cloth when I heard it. The gate latch clicked. I froze. No one had ever come through the garden gate without calling out first. Visitors always paused at the edge, respected the boundary I'd quietly built around this space. Even children waited at the entrance. But now, someone was stepping inside. I turned slowly. It was Michael, my son. For a moment, I couldn't speak. His silhouette was framed by the garden arch, where the jasmine climbed and bloomed in wild white knots. He looked different than I remembered. Older, heavier in the eyes, thinner in the frame. He held a single hand out in greeting, hesitant, unsure. "Hi, Mom," he said. My breath caught, not in pain, not in joy, in surprise. Not because he was there, but because I hadn't expected to feel calm. I didn't rush to him. I didn't scold or cry or collapse into his arms like the scene I might have imagined months ago. Instead, I stood where I was, steady, grounded. I looked at him like someone returning to a place they had no idea had changed. He glanced around, his eyes sweeping the beds of lavender, the tall sunflowers, the tidy lines of tomatoes and mint. His gaze lingered on the bench, then on the small painted sign by the path that read, "Here grows what was once forgotten." "This is beautiful," he said, voice soft. I nodded. "It is." He shifted awkwardly. "I didn't know you were doing all this." "No," I said. "You didn't." There was a silence between us, not the strained kind, but one that felt necessary, like a pause in a long, unfinished song. "I'm sorry," he said. Those two words sat in the air. I didn't reach for them. I didn't rush to absolve him. I let them stay where they were, incomplete, imperfect. I could see the weight on him, the guilt, the regret, the complicated mix of emotions that only surfaces when someone finally realizes they've been absent for too long. His eyes searched mine, perhaps hoping for a crack in the wall, a signal that I was still waiting for him to make it right. But I wasn't. You didn't knock, I said gently. He blinked. I figured you figured it was still yours to walk into. I smiled, not unkindly. But things have changed. He looked down at his hands. Can I come in? I hesitated. This was the moment. The kind of moment I used to dream about, when I imagined reconciliation, healing, reconnection. But now that it was here, I felt something else, entirely, strength. Because I wasn't the same woman he'd forgotten to call. I was someone who had learned to bloom in her own soil. You can sit with me, I said, but not today. Not yet. He nodded slowly, as if understanding that the gate wasn't locked out of cruelty, but out of protection. I'll wait, he said. That's a start, I replied. He left quietly, without pushing. He closed the gate behind him, and I stood there a while, heart steady, breath slow. Later, I sat on the bench, the sun warm on my shoulders, and thought about forgiveness. Not the kind you give away freely, but the kind you build slowly, like a garden, with patience, with boundaries, with the understanding that not everything grows back the same. I didn't cry, I didn't ache, I felt free, for the first time since I planted the first seed. I saw what I had really built, not just a place to escape from pain, but a life where I was no longer invisible, a space where I chose who to let in, and when, a reminder that I was worthy of happiness, with or without their return. And if they came back again, truly came back, I would decide what that meant, on my terms. Always. Is this chapter okay for you? Shall I continue with cap number 14? Você disse, ok. Siga em inglês. Cuide para não misturar as línguas, pois preciso do roteiro 100% em inglês. Capítulos nunca menores que 2.500. Cara, e esse o chat GPT disse. Certainly. Here's cap number 14. Continuing the story, with emotional realism, clear voice, and consistency, all in English and with the required depth and length. Cap hashtag 14. They started coming back slowly, cautiously, like people returning to a town they'd abandoned. Michael came first, as if testing the water. He didn't try to open the gate again, not after our last conversation. Instead, he stood outside it, waiting. I saw him through the slats while watering the lavender one morning. He didn't wave or call out. He just waited. Eventually, I walked over. We stood on either side of the gate, two people separated, not just by wood and metal, but by years of distance and a silence that had shaped us both. I've been thinking a lot, he said, about everything. I'm sure you have. He looked like he wanted to say more, maybe explain, maybe apologize again, but he didn't. He respected the air between us, and that was enough. I told him I was glad he came. I didn't open the gate. Sarah came next, 2 weeks later, holding a pie she'd bought from a bakery store-bought. I noticed. She stood with that same confident stance she's had since she was a teenager, the one that always said, I'll handle it. But her voice trembled when she spoke. I didn't realize how far away I'd let myself get, she said. I nodded. You didn't just drift, you left. She blinked. I didn't mean to, I know. She reached forward, as if tempted to place the pie on the bench beside the gate. I stepped back. You can leave it there, if you want, but I'm not ready to sit with you yet. Her face didn't change, but her eyes did. Something softened. She placed the pie down and whispered, I'll come again. Emily was the last. She cried as soon as she saw me, her hands shaking as she gripped the bars of the gate like a child locked out of a room she used to know. I don't know how we let it get like this, she sobbed. I thought you were okay. That's the problem, I said. I always made it too easy for you to believe I was. Her sobs turned into silence. I didn't open the gate for her either. Not yet. Not even then. It was hard, keeping that boundary. Everything in me wanted to wrap her in my arms, comfort her, make it better. But that's who I used to be, the fixer, the forgiver, the woman who rushed to smooth every edge. I had grown something different now, and I owed it to myself not to uproot it too soon. Over the following days, they each returned again, never together, never coordinated, just one at a time, arriving like seasons, unsure of themselves. They sat outside the gate, Sometimes they brought things, flowers, a scarf, a handwritten letter. Sometimes they brought nothing but their silence. I let them speak, I listened, but I didn't offer an invitation, because healing doesn't mean forgetting, and forgiveness isn't the same as access. I was no longer waiting to be needed. I had found richness in simplicity, happiness in stillness, wealth in my own attention. I was no longer trying to be everything to everyone. I was simply trying to be true to myself. The garden, still vibrant, reflected that truth. The rosemary had grown into a thick, fragrant bush. The sunflowers towered proudly over the fence line. Bright faces turned upward. The tomatoes ripened, slowly, perfectly. Even the once struggling jasmine now bloomed freely, draping the arch with wild elegance. Eleanor noticed. "Of course, you've changed," she said one evening, as we sat on the bench, sipping warm cider. "Not just the garden, you." I smiled. "I hope so. They're trying now. Your family, I see that. Will you let them in?" "Maybe," I said, "but not because they're family. Because they show me they deserve to be here." That was the difference. I wasn't closing the door forever, but I wasn't going to fling it open just because someone shared my blood. My garden had taught me that things grow best when given care, consistency, and sunlight, not just when planted, but all the way through. And that's what I needed now. Not a grand apology. Not a holiday gathering with forced smiles. I needed steady hands, gentle words, and real presence. I was no longer afraid of being alone, because I wasn't. Not really. I had myself. I had the garden. I had peace. And finally, after so many years of waiting, I had my own permission to choose who and what I let into my life. Is this chapter okay for you? Shall I continue with cap number 15, the final chapter, which will include the closing reflections and a strong call to action? Você disse, ok. Siga em inglês. Cuide para não misturar as línguas, pois preciso do roteiro 100% inglês. Capítulos nunca menores que 2.500. CAREACTE, RS, or ChatGPT. Dicen thank you. Here is cap number 15, the final chapter, a reflective, emotionally resonant conclusion with a powerful CTA. It remains fully in English, faithful to tone, length, and the character's voice. Cap number 15, I wake up with the light now. There's no alarm clock, no voice calling from another room, no urgent appointments to keep. Just the slow stretch of morning and the quiet promise of a day I get to shape however I please. Most mornings, I head straight to the garden before I even brush my hair. The grass is soft underfoot, the air still cool, and the world feels like it's pausing just for me. The gate is still there, sturdy, painted, closed, but not locked. It swings open when I choose, and sometimes I do open it. Sarah came by again, this time with less certainty and more curiosity. She didn't ask to come in. She brought a thermos of tea and 2 mugs, and we sat outside the gate like neighbors rather than mother and daughter. We talked about books, the weather. She told me her youngest wants to learn guitar. I told her about the way bees follow patterns we don't see. It was ordinary and beautiful. Michael visits the most now. He never asks questions he's not ready to hear answers to. He brings me mulch and helps fix things around the shed. He doesn't push for more. And in that silence, we found a quiet sort of repair. We don't need long apologies anymore. We're building something more honest. Even Emily came and stayed a while. She sat beside me, watched the butterflies hover near the rosemary, and cried again, but softer this time, not out of guilt, but release. She asked if she could plant something here. I gave her a small patch near the jasmine. She chose daisies. The garden accepts them all, in pieces, in pauses, never in a rush. And so do I. Ivy, come to understand that happiness isn't a destination we reach through the hands of others. It's what we grow in the space we make for ourselves. I used to believe love was sacrifice, that to be a mother meant to give until nothing was left. But I see now that love can also be a boundary, a decision, a sacred space you protect because you've learned its worth. I spent years asking the world to notice me. Now, I notice myself. That I walk through this garden every day and see a map of everything I've survived. The loneliness, the longing, the forgotten birthdays, the silence of unanswered calls. But I also see triumph, color, life, joy. This place didn't grow from bitterness. It grew from choice. Every flower, every leaf, every stone, a reminder that we are never too old to begin again, never too forgotten to matter. never too late to build something just for ourselves. And if you, dear listener, are hearing my story and seeing pieces of your own in it, I want you to know this: you are not invisible. You are not finished. You are allowed to begin again. You are allowed to build something beautiful in the space where others left nothing. Don't wait for the call that may never come. Don't live your days hoping someone will remember your work. Remember it yourself, today, right now. Plant your own joy, nurture it, watch it grow, because sometimes the richest, brightest, most honest parts of life bloom only after the world forgets your name, and you finally remember your own.